On the morning of January 31st, 1990, thousands of Soviet citizens stood in freezing temperatures outside a gleaming building on Pushkin Square in central Moscow, forming a line that stretched for blocks through the snow-covered streets. They had come to witness something that just a few years earlier would have been unthinkable, something that represented both the end of an era and the beginning of an uncertain future. They had come to eat at McDonald's. The opening of the first McDonald's restaurant in the Soviet Union was not merely a business transaction or a cultural curiosity. It was a seismic event that exposed the contradictions, desires, and transformations coursing through Soviet society in its final years. A moment when the ideological certainties of 70 years began to crumble beneath the weight of Big Macs and French fries. The story of how McDonald's came to Moscow begins not in 1990, but more than a decade earlier, in the corridors of power where business ambition collided with Cold War politics. George Cohan, a Canadian McDonald's executive who ran the company's operations in Canada, first conceived the idea of bringing the Golden Arches to the Soviet Union during the 1976 Montreal Olympics. Cohan had secured the rights to operate McDonald's restaurants at the Olympic venues, and it was there that he encountered Soviet officials who were fascinated by the efficiency and popularity of the American fast food operation. For Cohan, a man driven by both profit and the belief that business could bridge political divides, the Soviet Union represented the ultimate untapped market. He began what would become a 14-year odyssey of negotiations, setbacks, and persistence that would test every limit of patience and diplomatic skill. The obstacles were immense and multifaceted. The Soviet system was not designed to accommodate foreign businesses, especially American ones. The command economy operated on principles fundamentally incompatible with Western capitalism. There were no private property rights, no convertible currency, no supply chains that could deliver the standardized ingredients McDonald's required. Beyond these practical barriers stood ideological ones. McDonald's was not just a restaurant chain, but a symbol of American consumer culture, the very embodiment of the capitalist system that Soviet propaganda had spent decades denouncing as exploitative and decadent. Allowing McDonald's into Moscow would be an admission that perhaps the West had something to offer, that Soviet citizens might prefer American hamburgers to the offerings of state-run cafeterias and restaurants. For conservative elements within the Communist Party, this was tantamount to ideological surrender. Yet Cohan persisted, making more than 20 trips to Moscow between 1976 and 1988. Navigating the Byzantine bureaucracy of Soviet officialdom. He cultivated relationships with officials in the Ministry of Food Industry, the Moscow City Council, and various party organs. He understood that success would require not just business acumen, but also political sensitivity and cultural awareness. The breakthrough came in the mid-1980s with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev and his policies of glasnost and perestroika. Gorbachev's reforms were intended to revitalize the Soviet economy and open Soviet society to new ideas, though few could have predicted where these changes would ultimately lead. In this new climate of openness, the idea of allowing McDonald's into Moscow shifted from impossible to merely difficult. The negotiations that followed were unlike any McDonald's had conducted anywhere else in the world. The Soviet side insisted on conditions that would protect domestic interests and maintain some degree of control. McDonald's agreed to source virtually all its ingredients from within the Soviet Union, a requirement that would necessitate building an entirely new supply chain from scratch. The company committed to constructing a massive food processing facility in the Moscow suburb of Solntsevo, a 64,000-square-foot complex that would produce everything from hamburger buns to ketchup, according to McDonald's exacting specifications. This was not a simple matter of importing beef and potatoes. Soviet agriculture operated under collective farming systems that prioritized quantity over quality, and the concept of standardization was foreign to an economy where shortages and substitutions were routine. McDonald's had to teach Soviet farmers how to grow the specific varieties of potatoes needed for their fries, how to raise cattle that would produce the right kind of beef, how to cultivate lettuce that met their standards. The joint venture agreement signed in April 1988 was structured as a partnership between McDonald's Canada and the Moscow City Council's Department of Food Service. This arrangement gave the Soviet side a 51% stake, maintaining the appearance of Soviet control while allowing McDonald's to manage operations. The deal called for the construction of 20 McDonald's restaurants in Moscow over several years, with the first location to open on Pushkin Square, one of the most prominent and heavily trafficked sites in the Soviet capital. The investment required was substantial. McDonald's poured more than $50 million into the venture, an enormous sum that reflected both the costs of building infrastructure from nothing and the company's confidence that the Soviet market would eventually prove profitable. As construction proceeded through 1989, the Soviet Union was convulsing with change. The Berlin Wall fell in November of that year, sending shockwaves through the communist world. Independence movements were gaining strength in the Baltic republics. The Soviet economy was deteriorating rapidly, with shortages of basic goods becoming more severe and public frustration mounting. In this context, the upcoming opening of McDonald's took on symbolic weight far beyond what anyone had anticipated. For Soviet citizens, especially younger ones, McDonald's represented access to a world they had been told was both inferior to socialism and yet somehow forbidden to them. The cognitive dissonance was profound. If capitalism was failing and socialism was superior, why were Western consumer goods so desirable? Why did Soviet stores offer such limited selection and poor quality? The opening of McDonald's would force these questions into the open in the most public way possible. The restaurant itself was designed to be impressive, even overwhelming. At 700 seats, it was the largest McDonald's in the world at the time of its opening. The interior featured Soviet-made materials, but followed McDonald's design standards, creating a space that was simultaneously familiar to Western eyes and utterly alien in the Soviet context. The cleanliness, the bright lighting, the efficiency of the layout, all stood in stark contrast to typical Soviet dining establishments, which were often dingy, poorly maintained, and characterized by surly service and long waits. McDonald's promised something revolutionary in the Soviet context: fast, friendly service in a clean environment. The staff, all Soviet citizens, underwent intensive training that emphasized smiling, making eye contact, and treating customers with respect and courtesy. These were not typical features of Soviet service culture, where shortages and the absence of competition had created an environment where customers were often treated as nuisances rather than valued patrons. The training program for the first Soviet McDonald's employees was exhaustive and, for many participants, transformative. 700 workers were selected from thousands of applicants, and they spent weeks learning not just how to prepare food, but how to embody McDonald's service philosophy. They practiced greeting customers, taking orders, maintaining cleanliness standards, and working as coordinated teams. For young Soviets accustomed to the inefficiencies and indifference of the state sector, this was a revelation. They were being taught that work could be organized rationally, that quality mattered, that customers deserved respect. Some Western observers noted that McDonald's was essentially conducting a crash course in capitalist work culture, instilling values and practices that had no parallel in the Soviet system. The employees were paid in rubles at rates higher than typical Soviet service jobs, though still modest by Western standards, and they received benefits that were attractive in the Soviet context, including meals during shifts and access to the McDonald's uniform, which itself became a status symbol. As the opening date approached, anticipation built to extraordinary levels. Soviet media covered the upcoming event extensively, with some outlets treating it as a major news story comparable to political developments. The coverage was mixed, reflecting the divisions within Soviet society itself. Some commentators celebrated McDonald's arrival as a sign of progress and openness, evidence that the Soviet Union was joining the modern world. Others expressed concern about the Americanization of Soviet culture and the abandonment of traditional values. Hardline conservatives saw the whole affair as a capitulation to Western influence, a dangerous opening that would undermine Soviet identity. But for ordinary Muscovites, particularly young people, the debate was beside the point. They simply wanted to experience what they had seen in smuggled magazines and foreign films, to taste the food that had become synonymous with American prosperity and modernity. When the doors opened at 10 o'clock on the morning of January 31st, 1990, the scene was chaotic and euphoric. An estimated 30,000 people passed through the restaurant on that first day, shattering all previous McDonald's records for opening day traffic. The line outside never disappeared, with some customers waiting for hours in temperatures well below freezing just to get inside. Soviet police were deployed to manage the crowds and maintain order. Inside, the Soviet staff performed remarkably, processing orders with a speed and efficiency that amazed customers accustomed to glacial service. The menu was adapted slightly for Soviet tastes and economic realities, but the core offerings remained: the Big Mac, Chicken McNuggets, fries, and soft drinks. Prices were set in rubles at levels that were not cheap by Soviet standards but were still accessible to many Muscovites, especially younger workers and students who had saved for the occasion. A Big Mac cost 3 rubles and 75 kopecks at a time, when the average Soviet monthly salary was around 200 rubles, making it a splurge, but not an impossibility. The experience of eating at McDonald's was, for many Soviet citizens, genuinely overwhelming. The speed of service was shocking. In Soviet restaurants, waiting 30 minutes or more for food was normal. At McDonald's, orders were ready in minutes. The cleanliness was equally striking. The bathrooms were spotless, regularly cleaned throughout the day, with working fixtures and soap and toilet paper, amenities that could not be taken for granted in Soviet public facilities. The food itself, while not necessarily superior to traditional Russian cuisine, was consistent, hot, and served with a smile. Perhaps most importantly, there was no shortage. In a society where empty shelves and long lines for basic goods had become routine, the sight of unlimited hamburgers, fries, and drinks was almost surreal. Customers could order as much as they could afford, and it would be there, ready, without substitution or apology. This abundance, more than the taste of the food itself, was what drove people to wait in the cold for hours. The opening of McDonald's in Moscow became an international media sensation. Western journalists descended on Pushkin Square to document the scene, recognizing it as a powerful symbol of the Cold War's end. Footage of Soviet citizens eagerly consuming American fast food was broadcast around the world, often accompanied by commentary about the triumph of capitalism and the inevitable collapse of communism. For many Western observers, the images confirmed what they had long believed, that given the choice, people everywhere would prefer Western consumer culture to Soviet austerity. The narrative was perhaps too simple, but the optics were undeniable. Here were citizens of the world's other superpower, the nation that had challenged American power for decades, lining up to buy hamburgers, the most American of foods. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Yet the reality was more complex than the triumphalist Western narrative suggested. For Soviet citizens, McDonald's represented not just American culture, but something more fundamental: the desire for normalcy, for access to goods and services that people in other countries took for granted. The enthusiasm for McDonald's was not necessarily an embrace of capitalism as an ideology, but rather a rejection of the failures of the Soviet system to provide basic consumer satisfaction. Decades of propaganda about the superiority of socialism had collided with the daily reality of shortages, poor quality, and indifferent service. McDonald's, whatever its flaws, delivered on its promises. The food was consistent, the service was friendly, and the experience was pleasant. In a society where such things were rare, this was revolutionary. The success of the Pushkin Square location exceeded even McDonald's most optimistic projections. In its first year, the restaurant served millions of customers, maintaining its position as the busiest McDonald's in the world. The company moved forward with plans to open additional locations in Moscow and eventually in other Soviet cities, though the political upheaval of the early 1990s complicated these efforts. The joint venture structure proved resilient even as the Soviet Union itself collapsed. When the USSR officially dissolved in December 1991, McDonald's operations in Russia continued with minimal interruption, adapting to the new economic realities of the post-Soviet era. The supply chain that had been built with such difficulty became a valuable asset as Russia transitioned to a market economy, providing a model for how Western companies could operate in the chaotic environment of 1990s Russia. The long-term impact of McDonald's arrival in the Soviet Union extended far beyond the restaurant industry. The success of the venture demonstrated that Western companies could operate in Russia if they were willing to invest heavily and adapt to local conditions. The training programs McDonald's implemented became a template for how to introduce Western business practices to a workforce raised under socialism. Thousands of young Russians who worked at McDonald's in the 1990s went on to careers in business, bringing with them the lessons they had learned about customer service, efficiency, and quality control. In this sense, McDonald's served as an informal business school, teaching skills and attitudes that had been largely absent from Soviet economic culture. The social and cultural impact was equally significant. McDonald's became a gathering place for young Muscovites, a space that was neither fully Russian nor fully Western, but something new. It was a place where people could experience a version of Western consumer culture without leaving their own country, a kind of safe zone for exploring the ideas and aesthetics that had been kept at arm's length for so long. The restaurant's popularity also highlighted the generational divide in Soviet and post-Soviet society. Older Russians, raised in the Stalin era and shaped by the hardships of World War II and its aftermath, often viewed McDonald's with suspicion or disdain, seeing it as a symbol of Western decadence and a threat to Russian traditions. Younger Russians, by contrast, embraced it enthusiastically, seeing no contradiction between eating American fast food and maintaining their Russian identity. This generational split would become a defining feature of post-Soviet Russian society, with profound political and cultural implications. The story of McDonald's in Russia also illustrates the complex relationship between economic liberalization and political change. Gorbachev's decision to allow McDonald's into Moscow was part of his broader effort to reform the Soviet system without abandoning socialism itself. He believed that introducing elements of market economics and opening up to Western ideas could revitalize the Soviet Union and make it more competitive with the West. What he failed to anticipate was that these reforms would unleash forces that could not be controlled or contained within the existing political structure. Once Soviet citizens had tasted the fruits of consumer capitalism, even in the limited form of a fast food restaurant, It became increasingly difficult to justify the privations and restrictions of the Soviet system. McDonald's did not cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it was part of the constellation of factors that made that collapse seem inevitable in retrospect. The economic model McDonald's employed in the Soviet Union also deserves examination. By building a complete supply chain within the country, rather than importing ingredients, McDonald's created a system that was relatively insulated from currency fluctuations and import restrictions. This vertical integration was expensive and time-consuming to establish, but it gave the company control over quality and reliability in an environment where both were scarce. The Sontsevo Food Processing Center became a showcase for Western food production technology, with Soviet officials and managers visiting to study its operations. The facility processed potatoes from Russian farms into French fries, baked buns according to McDonald's specifications, produced beef patties, and manufactured condiments, all to standards that were unprecedented in Soviet food production. The contrast with typical Soviet food processing operations, which were often antiquated and poorly maintained, was stark. The pricing strategy McDonald's adopted was also carefully calibrated. The company needed to set prices high enough to cover costs and generate profit, but low enough to be accessible to a significant portion of the population. The decision to price menu items at levels that were affordable for young workers and students, even if they represented a splurge, proved crucial to the restaurant's success. Had McDonald's positioned itself as an exclusive luxury accessible only to the elite, it would have failed to achieve the mass appeal that made it culturally significant. Instead, by making the experience attainable for ordinary Muscovites willing to save or spend a bit extra, McDonald's became a democratizing force, a place where people from different social strata could mingle and share a common experience. The reaction of the Soviet government to McDonald's success was telling. Rather than viewing it as a threat, officials increasingly saw it as a model worth emulating, at least in the final years of the USSR. The efficiency, cleanliness, and customer satisfaction McDonald's achieved stood in sharp contrast to the state-run food service operations that had long been a source of public complaint. Some Soviet managers and officials began to ask why their own establishments could not achieve similar results. The answer, of course, was systemic. The absence of competition, the lack of incentives for quality and service, the chronic shortages of supplies, and the overall inefficiency of the command economy all conspired to produce the dismal state of Soviet consumer services. McDonald's succeeded not because it possessed some secret formula, but because it operated according to market principles in an environment that had been starved of them. The cultural controversy surrounding McDonald's in Russia did not end with the Soviet Union's collapse. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, the expansion of McDonald's and other Western fast food chains became a focal point for debates about Russian identity and the country's relationship with the West. Critics argued that the proliferation of American restaurants represented a form of cultural imperialism, the erosion of Russian traditions and values in favor of homogenized global consumer culture. Defenders countered that Russians were perfectly capable of choosing what they wanted to eat, and that the success of McDonald's reflected genuine consumer preferences rather than imposed foreign influence. These debates reflected deeper anxieties about Russia's place in the post-Cold War world and the direction of the country's development. By the time Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, McDonald's had become thoroughly integrated into Russian urban life, with dozens of locations across the country. The company continued to expand, adapting its menu to include items that appealed to Russian tastes while maintaining its core offerings. The relationship between McDonald's and the Russian government remained generally positive. with the company viewed as a responsible corporate citizen that provided employment and paid taxes. However, the geopolitical tensions that emerged in the 2010s, particularly after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, created new challenges. Western sanctions and Russian countersanctions disrupted supply chains and complicated operations. In 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, McDonald's made the decision to exit the Russian market entirely, selling its Russian operations to a local buyer and ending more than 3 decades of presence in the country. The restaurants were rebranded under a new name, Systema Pishchevi Technologii, operating as Vkusno I Toshka, or Tasty and that's it, continuing to serve many of the same menu items but without the McDonald's name and branding. The arc of McDonald's in Russia, from the euphoric opening in 1990 to the withdrawal in 2022, encapsulates much of the post-Cold War history of Russian-Western relations. The initial period of openness and optimism, the belief that Russia would integrate smoothly into the global capitalist system, the gradual disillusionment and reassertion of Russian nationalism, and finally, the rupture brought on by geopolitical conflict all played out against the backdrop of golden arches and Big Macs. The story serves as a reminder that economic integration and cultural exchange, while powerful forces, do not automatically translate into political harmony or shared values. The thousands of Russians who waited in line on that cold January morning in 1990 were not thinking about geopolitics or ideology. They simply wanted to try something new, to participate in an experience that had been denied to them. In that moment, the Cold War truly seemed to be ending, and a new era of possibility was beginning. That the story would end with McDonald's leaving Russia 3 decades later, amid war and renewed East-West confrontation, is a sobering reminder of how fragile progress can be, and how the forces of history are never fully under control.